Right.
I want to welcome everybody to the Boyd Law Building and back to another event in our Hubble Environmental Law Initiative series. And this has been a great series for us. Really, Charlotte Hubble had a vision to do several things. One of them is increase the environmental law bar in Iowa so that there's more young lawyers and, doing this kind of work. But one of the other things they really wanted to do was increase engagement among the community on environmental issues. And so it's been really successful. Professor Shannon Raisler has been leading this effort with Blake and Ruth. And please join me in thanking Blake for. And I'm not just welcoming all of you, I'm also welcoming LeRoy Paddock, who is a 1977 graduate of the University of Iowa College of Law. So students, he once sat, at least figuratively, where you sit, not literally, because it was a different building back then. We've only been in this building since the 1986. But he's been doing environmental law that whole time, since 1977, honestly. And he started out, he worked for Chief Judge Don Lay of the 8th Circuit. Judge Lay was also one of our grads, and his practice was to take the very best students as his law clerks after they graduated. So you can be assured that Professor Paddock was outstanding even back then. He after working for Judge Lay, he went to he went to Minnesota, and he was an assistant attorney general in Minnesota for.
No Minnesota jokes, please. we know Iowa.
There is a funny one.
Okay.
But he spent about 20 years in the AG's office in Minnesota, dealing with a lot of the same issues that we are now facing here today, and maybe even worse now these days. But he worked on not only environmental policy, but also agriculture and natural resources policy as well. So he's been a long time doing that. And then he went into sort of the academic world, and he started at Pace Law School, which is one of the leading environmental law schools in the country. They've long had a strong environmental program, and it's in the suburbs of New York City. And spent about 5 or 6 years there, and then went to George Washington University in our nation's capital, and was the associate dean for our environmental programs at GW. And did that for quite a while, and he's still affiliated with GW, although now more on a part-time basis, I gather. But was very well known around the country. In part, he does a lot of work with the Environmental Law Institute, and has been involved in these discussions nationally for a very, very long time. He's going to talk today about some international issues in environmental law enforcement, including issues related to plastics. And I'm looking very much forward to it. And so please join me in welcoming Professor Paddock.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm really pleased to be here. Iowa launched my career. It gave me the opportunity to work for Judge Lay, which gave me the opportunity to be in the Minnesota Attorney General's office, and then ultimately led to my academic career. So I'm very proud of my affiliation with the University of Iowa Law School. I'm going to talk today, excuse me, my voice gets a little crackly, but I'm suffering from seasonal allergies, as many of us are. So I may have to take a water break now and then, but I'm going to talk about kind of the back room of environmental law, and that's environmental compliance and enforcement. We spend a lot of time thinking about drafting environmental laws, both here in the United States and around the world. And in many countries around the world, environmental laws are actually quite strong if you look at the legal documents themselves. But where many environmental laws suffer and many countries suffer is the implementation of those environmental laws. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of resources to effectively enforce environmental laws. And so that is the focus of this discussion is where are we at? And what are some of the problems? And what are some of the new issues? And what are some of the new resources that we have that can allow more effective enforcement of environmental laws? So I'm going to talk about the organization that I work with, which is the primary home for the international work I do. It's called the International Network for Environmental Compliance and Enforcement. We are a very small organization. It's part-time me and part-time one environmental fellow at the Environmental Law Institute. But our organization has been around since 1988, founded by the Dutch government, then the Dutch Ministry of Environment and Spatial Planning, and US EPA, with the specific goal of helping to build capacity for environmental compliance and enforcement around the world. So our job, our work, is raising awareness of the importance of compliance and enforcement, developing networks around the world for enforcement cooperation, and strengthening the capacity to implement and enforce environmental laws. And the Secretariat is the Environmental Law Institute. So these are some of the regional networks we work with. We have a network in South Asia. It's the Asian Environmental Compliance and Enforcement Network that's in Bangkok. We work with the East African Network for Environmental Compliance and Enforcement in Nairobi. My Spanish is kind of rough, so I'll just refer to Red La Fica in Santiago, Chile, which covers Central and South America. And our largest collaborating organization is the Australasian Environmental Law Enforcement and Regulators Network, headquartered in Sydney, and covers Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. We also work with a lot of organizations in Europe. The Inspectors and Regulators Network is IMPEL. Interpol is the International Police Organization. They have an environmental crimes working group that we collaborate with. A parallel organization in Europe called Europol, and the European Prosecutors Network, which consists of environmental prosecutors across Europe and in the UK. So our next big event, we've had 10 previous international environmental compliance conferences since 1991. We'll be holding our 11th meeting in Brisbane in early November, along with the ALERT network. And this is going to be an important meeting because we're focusing on many of the issues that I'm going to talk about today: monitoring plastics, climate change. And the purpose of this meeting is going to produce new forms of collaboration on environmental compliance and enforcement around the world. So we're just starting to plan that meeting, but really looking forward to joining together with folks around the world to discuss how to improve environmental compliance and enforcement. Well, just a little background before I get into some of the specific issues. Some of you know this already, so it's not news, but question in the US and elsewhere, who enforces, I'm going to talk mostly here about who enforces in the US. Of course, the EPA plays a big role in that, the US Environmental Protection Agency, with the assistance of the US Department of Justice for litigation. And they do it out of primarily out of their 10 regional offices in the US. EPA plays a very important role in enforcement, especially in targeted areas. And I'll talk about the areas that EPA is currently focusing on. But importantly, states are critical in the US for enforcement. Well, EPA does a lot of enforcement. 90% of the environmental enforcement cases in the US come from the states. Without strong state enforcement, you don't have strong enforcement overall because EPA simply doesn't have the workforce to bring enforcement cases around the country. There's also an important role in the US for citizen suits, especially under the Clean Water Act. Why? Because federal law allows citizens, like river keepers organizations, for example, to bring lawsuits to stop pollution. So the states are probably the most important enforcement organization in the country, followed by the federal government, followed by citizens in the form of citizen suits, especially under the Clean Water Act. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the enforcement tools that are being used, especially inspections and monitoring. I'm going to spend a little time talking about why we use primarily administrative enforcement to do environmental enforcement, and a little bit about the role of criminal enforcement in assuring that our laws are complied with. I mentioned just briefly that EPA sets national enforcement initiatives. This is the new list as of this year. I think they're every 3 or 5 years, EPA every 3 years looks at those priorities. So you've got 3 of these. Let's see if what this has. So the priorities on the left side are ongoing priorities that EPA picked up and carried from its previous list. So air toxics in environmental justice communities. One of the things that's for EPA that's been especially important over the Biden administration, and it was also true in the Obama administration, is dealing with enforcement issues in environmental justice communities. Both the Obama administration and the Biden administration have specific policies related to enforcement that is designed to encourage paying special attention to communities that are otherwise underserved, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Drinking water compliance has long been a priority. That's an important issue in the Midwest, where we have a lot of agricultural contamination that can reach drinking water supplies. And it's also an area where there's been some innovative practices by the states. I'll mention one later from Massachusetts. Chemical risk, another priority from ammonia and hydrogen fluoride. Again, an Iowa issue. We've got a lot of ammonia used in the state for fertilizer purposes. The new priorities that EPA is beginning to focus on, not surprisingly, PFAS. All over the country now, EPA is adopting a new PFAS rule. I think it's going to land under the Superfund law or the Comprehensive Environmental Compliance under CERCLA. Mitigating climate risk. This is one of the first times that EPA in its enforcement work has specifically begun focusing on climate issues, and that is in 2 areas. HFC, those are the fluorinated compounds that are basically the refrigerants that are used in your cars and in your refrigerators. Those need to be phased out. HFCs replaced CHFCs, which were ozone depleters. That all occurred about 20 years ago. The HFCs replaced the ozone depleters, but it turns out that the HFCs are very significant greenhouse gases. And the US recently signed what's called the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which calls for a rapid phase out of those refrigerants And there are a lot of issues with international trade in HFCs that I'll mention a little bit later. And then another new one is protecting communities from coal ash. So we've got a lot of coal ash storage facilities all over the country that have cadmium and mercury and other heavy metals associated with them. And EPA is turning its focus to those facilities to try to protect water quality around the country. All right, I want to talk a little bit about some of the changes that have occurred in inspections and why this is a growing area of interest. The pandemic was one of the reasons why this is a different area of focus now. During the pandemic, the typical inspections that would be done by state or federal facilities couldn't be done. You couldn't walk onto a facility very easily and conduct normal inspections. So a lot more remote monitoring and review of other types of documents were used during the early part of the pandemic. And the question now is, can we learn from those practices to make inspections more efficient? Can we use more remote monitoring? Can we use more document review to understand where violations are coming from? Because our inspection workforce in this country is pretty thin, especially thin at the state level. And we need to be able to develop tools that allow us to understand when violations are occurring that don't require the level of manpower that might have been available in the past. There's also a very limited ability to inspect smaller facilities in this country. And there are a lot of them. Small quantity hazardous waste generators, body shops, paint shops. In Minnesota, there were more than 10,000, probably considerably more than 10,000 of those facilities. The legislative auditor once looked at it and said some of those shops might be inspected, given government resources, every 10 to 50 years.
Wow.
Yeah, wow is right. So finding new tools that can identify violations is really important. Perhaps it's involving local governments in inspections. Sometimes in Minnesota, we use self-reporting checklists to try to identify areas where there might be concern, but also eliminate from inspection facilities where we were getting good information and felt that it was easier to assume that they were in compliance. Third-party inspections is another way of getting at that. And I'll mention a little bit more about how that's done. And I did mention the self-audit checklist, which Minnesota uses for a lot of small businesses that may be subject, especially to the hazardous waste laws. So third-party verification, relatively new, probably in the last 7 or 8, maybe 10 years in the US. And the idea here is that essentially deputized private inspectors would inspect certain types of facilities where they were a lot of the facilities where the violations could be relatively easily understood. So in Massachusetts, which has led the innovation in this area, third-party inspections are done for things like this: formaldehyde in plywood manufacturing, underground storage tanks, and solid waste facilities. So it's a way of expanding the workforce, and typically there's an inspection fee that pays for the cost of those third-party inspections. Other innovations that have been really important have been electronic reporting. This is almost a DAF moment, like, why haven't we been doing electronic reporting for some time? But it's only in the last 5 or 6 years that under the Clean Water Act, what are known as discharge monitoring reports. And these are the monthly reports that facilities that have a Clean Water Act permit have to submit that shows they're in compliance with the permit limits for various types of pollutants. Historically, those had been submitted in paper form. And you can imagine an agency, whether it's a state or federal agency, going through tens of thousands of these reports, because they're monthly reports from lots of facilities, and trying to identify violations. And think about how easy that might be to have a computer program that has those limits in it, and you run the electronic report through it, and the violations just pop up. So then you save a lot of time, and you can focus on violators. So this is an important development. It's beginning to be looked at around the world for these kinds of mandatory reporting requirements. And it is potentially a very important way of expanding resources. The similar thing is with what are called continuous emission monitors. So in our acid rain law in the US, power companies that are subject to the Clean Air Act have continuous emission monitors on each of their smokestacks. And those continuous emission monitors report directly to EPA. So we know hour by hour, and we know at the federal agency what that information is. So our acid rain program knows how much sulfur dioxide is being emitted every day from power plants. There's a cap and trade program here that allows power plants, if they're going to exceed their limitation, to buy allowances or sell allowances if they have more than they need. They have to true that up at the end of the year, but then the information can be verified against the self-reported, real-time reported continuous emission monitoring data. That law has required virtually no enforcement because the penalties are so high. You lose allowances if you exceed your limit, and you also have to pay $2,000 a ton in penalties when you can buy on the market acid rain allowances or sulfur dioxide allowances for about $200 or less. So the design of the program here made it essentially self-enforcing, which is an important element in looking at the design of any environmental law going forward. Okay, monitoring. We're all familiar with some form of environmental monitoring, but there are a lot of knowledge gaps. We do have a water quality monitoring program. It's sporadic. We have data from facilities, and we have occasional monitoring of lakes and rivers. On the air quality side, most of our monitoring, not all of it, but most of the monitoring is regional monitoring. So in Houston, for example, there might be 6 regional air pollution monitoring stations around the whole city for conventional pollutants. That, and in greenhouse gas monitoring, we have greenhouse gas reporting, but we don't have very much at the kind of city scale or neighborhood scale to understand where greenhouse gases are coming from. This presents a really important environmental justice problem, especially for exposure to hazardous emissions from small facilities. We don't have, by and large, a neighborhood monitoring system in this country for air toxics. And a lot of small businesses that have toxic emissions exist in neighborhoods around the country, and many of those are in low income or communities of color. So monitoring is a critical issue, and a lot of new developments are occurring here. So they occur in a variety of areas, including new advanced monitoring technologies, new data analytics approaches. We're just entering the AI era of analyzing data to try to understand where problems are, and the really rapidly growing field of citizen science. So Citizen science is an interesting issue. There are lots of citizen scientists around this country, and with new monitoring technology, they're able to do a lot more in terms of gathering data. So EPA's Advisory Council, our Committee on Environmental Policy and Technology, has suggested that EPA needed to implement a vision for citizen science, dedicate funding to citizen science, and take a more collaborative approach to citizen science. Agency staff sometimes just reject the idea that data coming from outside of the agency is valuable for any purpose, let alone for enforcement purposes, where there can be some significant issues about the quality of the data if you're using it in an enforcement context. EPA's own Inspector General said that EPA needed a comprehensive vision and strategy for citizen science. And during the Obama administration, the head of the Office of Science and Technology said that EPA should apply a fitness for use as to data quality. In other words, not all that citizen data is maybe the highest quality or have quality control protocol associated with it, but the data can still be useful for some purposes, and EPA should take that into account. Interestingly, a little known law passed in 2016, the Crowdsourcing and Citizen Science Act, bipartisan legislation, has said that the head of each federal agency may utilize crowdsourcing and science, citizen science, to conduct projects to advance the agency of the mission of the agency. So there's a lot of kind of background support for the idea of citizen science. In the Clean Water Act, there's been a long history where citizens have been involved in water quality monitoring, but again, it's fairly sporadic. There's no significant history in the Clean Air Act of extensive or organized citizen monitoring. In the Clean Water Act, there are actually protocols that EPA has developed for citizen monitoring. And as I mentioned, the Clean Air Act monitoring is sporadic. There is monitoring for conventional pollutants and inside the fence line of facilities, but neighborhood monitoring really is lacking. And this one figure indicated that 91% of the communities of color have air pollution related risks above health guidelines. So there's a reason to worry. With climate monitoring, very diffuse pollutant in many cases. And in two of those, methane and carbon dioxide, come from a lot of sources, and we don't have much monitoring data in those areas. So there are a variety of technologies that are being developed. This is one example from Louisville using aerial infrared monitoring to detect discharges into a river. This is an example from Clemson University, because citizen science can be citizens, it can be organizations, or it can be universities that do this. This is a real-time in situ measurement of water quality along a river. The same kind of thing is being done in the Hudson River, which will give us continuous data about water quality, something that's quite new. Let's see, wrong way. Infrared cameras are now in fairly wide use. The tank on the upper left is what you see if you look at the petroleum storage tank. The view on the left is what you see with an infrared camera, volatile organic emissions coming from tanks, not otherwise easily detectable. So infrared cameras are important. Handheld citizen monitors are developing rapidly. Some are very accurate. Others, like particulate matter, are still have some accuracy problems. This data we can expect to rapidly increase in the next several years. And there is going to be important issues about how and when it can be used in enforcement cases as potential evidence of violation. Drones are now playing a significant role. So the Potomac River Keeper uses drones to monitor for a wide variety of pollutants in both the Potomac River and the Shenandoah River. Again, there are privacy issues raised with drones that are important. And these same technologies, I'm focusing these technologies on their use in the US, are beginning to be a part of how enforcement agencies around the world look at how they're going to deploy their inspection resources and where they can get data from satellites. So the Environmental Defense Fund, which is a big national nonprofit environmental organization, I think maybe just this week launched its methane satellite, which can detect methane emissions at a very small resolution around the world. And that should prove to be an important resource for environmental agencies. NASA this summer launched its Tempo satellite, which is the first space-based instrument designed to do continuous air pollution, air quality monitoring above North America. So satellites, drones are all playing important roles. All right, so that's it for monitoring. I want to turn a little bit to what enforcement tools we're using. Early on in environmental enforcement in the US and elsewhere, we relied pretty heavily on just injunctive orders. Stop that pollution penalties not necessarily associated with that, and relied on civil judicial actions and minor crimes as the way we approached enforcement penalties. There've been at least in the 90s and the early 2000s, a fairly substantial movement away from relying on those tools. We still rely on civil judicial penalties, but much more now on administrative penalty orders. And we've moved away from misdemeanor crimes. If we have environmental criminal enforcement, we want it to be more serious environmental felonies. The reason we, in Minnesota was a good example, is we relied a lot on misdemeanor crimes, but prosecutors just didn't want to prosecute misdemeanors. That usually meant a maximum of 1 year in prison and small fines. And judges didn't want them on as part of their docket. And as a result, misdemeanors were not a very successful way of enforcing environmental law. So we turned to administrative penalty orders, which are much more efficient. They can address problems that just weren't being addressed by criminal penalties. So, for example, in Minnesota, when we amended the enforcement laws, there were no penalties at all from the State Pollution Control Agency for violations that would merit a penalty of under $10,000. None, because it took too much time, too much staff time. When we did administrative penalties, we started seeing a rapid increase in penalties in that lower bracket. EPA relies very heavily on administrative penalty orders. They still do civil litigation if they, in a number of cases, but most of their enforcement now is through administrative penalty orders. In the UK, they had the same problem. The UK's environmental laws relied heavily on misdemeanor crimes, and they were found to be ineffective, so they adopted the same approach using administrative penalty orders. 1980s and 90s, we got environmental crimes, which had significant penalties, 3 years, sometimes as high as 15 years. Primarily focusing on hazardous waste crimes. There's still a small percentage of enforcement, but they can be really important. And here's a few examples. The BP Horizon case one of the most significant aspects of that case was a $4 billion criminal fine. In the Volkswagen Dieselgate case, $2.8 billion criminal fine. How do you affect the behavior of a really big company like BP or VW? This is one way you can change behavior. It's $1 million civil penalty is not going to change it. Even $10 million civil penalties, and these did change behavior significantly. Walmart, there was an $81 million fine for a criminal fine for illegal disposal of hazardous waste. It changed Walmart's business practices throughout the country. Maybe not so much for the penalty, but the idea that Walmart was convicted or pled guilty to an environmental crime is something they don't want to see in their public relations campaigns. And there's also liability for corporate officers. So in the Volkswagen case, there were actually, I think, 6 Volkswagen executives that were charged with crimes, and one of them decided it was going to take a vacation from Germany to Florida. And guess what happened? The police found him in Florida, and he was arrested and convicted. And there are serious penalties associated with this. So up to 18 months presumptive sentences under the federal sentencing guidelines. So, company executives commit environmental crimes at a significant risk in the US. So while environmental criminal penalties are a small segment of how we enforce the law, they're very important in some of the cases like this. Internationally, there are a lot of issues where criminal enforcement is important, because in many of these cases, criminal syndicates are involved. We're not dealing with corporations who make big mistakes. We're dealing with criminals who are using environmental resources for money laundering, sometimes directly for illegal timber harvesting, for trade in endangered species, for trade in banned substances like HFCs, and for illegally disposing, often in poorer countries, of plastics and electronic waste. I'm going to turn a little bit to environmental justice. Let's see how I do it here. In the US, the first environmental justice executive order was in 1994, which called for fair treatment of all people and meaningful involvement of all people in environmental regulation and enforcement, kind of distributional and procedural justice issues. There's been a long series of reports many years ago by the National Law Journal that indicated enforcement is more stringent in more well-to-do communities, and cleanups are slower and less stringent in minority communities. During the Obama administration, there was a lot of focus on environmental justice, including in enforcement, and some specific goals and guidelines about how to conduct enforcement in a way that would be more fair across communities. The Biden administration has reinforced that with a new executive order on environmental justice in Executive Order 14096, which specifically mentions the need for adequate compliance programs and remedies. So enforcement is specifically part of that executive order. An interesting concept elsewhere in the world, though, that builds on this is the concept of restorative justice. And this is the idea that the community that is harmed should be play a role in what the penalty is and what the remedy is for environmental violation. That might mean direct involvement in the negotiations related to the harm, or that the remedy should be directed at repairing the harm in that community in order to restore the communities to their prior situation. The idea behind restorative justice, which is really being emphasized in Australia. They're the leader in working in this area, is that crime is a violation of people, of people and relationships, that the response to crime should be inclusive, and responses to crime should heal and put things right. So this is an important new concept, not widely used in the world, but it adds to the procedural justice. Let's see. Oops, I'm sorry. Let me go back here. So it adds to the distributional justice and procedural justice an element of restorative justice. In the US, there is a process that's somewhat like this. It's called supplemental environmental projects. It is not part of the legal remedy directly, other than it's a part of a negotiated settlement. So a company that is subject to a significant fine can negotiate with the Department of Justice a supplemental environmental project, which is aimed at restoring some of the conditions in the community affected, or providing benefits to the community that's been affected. And there are a variety of factors that have to be taken into account to ensure that there's a nexus between the settlement and the violation. I'm going to skip those. So we can get to some of the emerging issues that are on the enforcement agenda. Plastics, perhaps the number one. It's a big issue around the world. Every country we work with has raised plastics as an issue. The climate issues, ways of using transparency to support enforcement, how the private sector is playing in this, and green supply management, green supply chain management, and then just finishing on a note on data analytics and AI. So for the past year, the UN has been negotiating a plastics treaty. The next meeting for the treaty negotiations is in April in Ottawa, and then the final negotiation is in Korea this fall. The compliance issues here include what will the treaty include related to effective implementation, because the treaties can talk about what the requirements are, but we think that the treaties need to also at least begin addressing how countries should implement the law. And importantly, what capacity building mechanisms should be included in the treaty itself, so that once it's adopted by countries, there is the ability to train and develop enforcement capacity in countries around the world. And then finally, what kind of reporting requirements need to be there to ensure that countries are actually taking the treaty seriously? In climate enforcement, I mentioned a lot already, the refrigerants issue. The US ratified the Kigali amendments to the Montreal Protocol in 2022. This was an important development because the US history over the last 20 or 30 years is we don't adopt or ratify treaties. We play in treaties, but we don't formally adopt them. We have with this. So for US, that's going to be a really important player, and it's a priority issue at EPA now, is to ensure, as we're phasing out HFCs, there's not a significant illegal trade as there was 20 plus years ago in HCFCs in the ozone context. So this is an interesting enforcement issue because it involves customs folks a lot. So the environmental folks have to work with customs officials to try to interdict illegal trade. And here's an area where we anticipate significant criminal violations. Back to the treaty. I probably had those a bit out of order, so sorry. In the treaty negotiation, the treaty itself is really broad ranging. So it includes potential bans on single-use plastics. It has a lot of focus on what do we do about ocean pollution. It addresses emissions from plastics production, and there are a lot of emissions associated, including hazardous emissions from plastics production. It wants to play in plastics design. So how do we regulate plastics design so they're more recyclable? And importantly, addresses an issue that in the US has been hard to get traction on, and that's called extended producer responsibility. The one place in the US where we've done a lot of extended producer responsibility is e-waste. So 26 states have laws that say that manufacturers of televisions, computers, those kinds of electronic equipment have to find a way to take them back. And generally the way they do that is that they hire an organization to collect the waste and then to recycle it, hopefully in an appropriate way, but that's also an enforcement issue. 3 states in the US have now adopted extended producer responsibility laws for plastics. Maine, I think it's Oregon and California. So they will be requiring plastics manufacturers of certain types of plastics to take that back. Again, the same mechanism, they'll hire a company that will collect the waste, and then they're supposed to use that to ensure that the waste, kind of a circular economy issue, to get the waste back in and reuse. So the plastics negotiation are looking very closely at extended producer responsibility, and the question is how will that be enforced? Just want to quickly wrap up so we have a little time for questions. So methane is important because it's 80 times more of a stronger greenhouse gas than CO2. There's a new EPA law in this area, and monitoring technology like the EDF satellite is going to be important to that issue. There are other issues with climate, new border enforcement taxes in the EU. Will those be adopted elsewhere? How do you enforce those? How do we enforce the offsets that all of us have seen from airlines and other places that California uses? And ensuring that reporting is accurate about greenhouse gases. I mentioned transparency. So Massachusetts, again, a leader in thinking about innovative ways, have had drinking water systems were required to mail reports directly to customers about how they were doing, and that was seen as reducing violations by 30 to 44% just by requiring disclosure of the information to people who may care about it. And then I'll just wrap up here by mentioning private enforcement. So the last 10 years have been a lot of companies that have adopted green supply chain standards. They look very much like environmental standards that a government might set, but they're private standards. And there's always the possibility that those are greenwashing standards, that they aren't really enforced, but companies that really look at them hard or set very good green supply chain rules can reach outside of the country, which our laws can't do. So we can affect, Target can affect what's happening in Thailand or in China with its green supply chain standards. And that's important in dealing with the scope of environmental violations that we have to deal with today. You have to be careful to ensure that they're legitimate, but it's an important advancement in environmental enforcement, at least in my view. And with that, I will wrap up and happy to take any questions anybody might have. Sherman, you've got one to your right or left over there.
Great presentation. Thank you for coming. My question is, Iowa is there's only 2 states in the country that didn't take delegation of RCRA, and Iowa is one of them. How do you think that affects the enforcement of the hazardous waste regulations?
Yeah, as I mentioned, you know, in most cases, about 90% of enforcement is done by the state.
Are we lucky?
What is it?
Yeah,
RECRA is the hazardous waste regulation.
yeah, it deals with ongoing operations. So if you're a company that manufactures material and you have solvents, RCRA regulates how you store those, what labels you put on them. It regulates shipment from generator to whatever the disposal facility is, and regulates the disposal facility itself. We mentioned that small facilities are especially difficult to deal with because there's so many of them. RCRA is an example. Every gas station, every body shop, every paint shop, every dry cleaner, for the most part, has small quantity hazardous waste that they generate. If you're relying on EPA inspectors from your region to try to reach all of those, it's going to be more difficult than if you have, 10 RCRA inspectors in Iowa to do that work. In Minnesota, we only have 11 inspectors for the whole state. In many of these cases, it really needs to be delegated even to local governments to do some of those inspections. So the Twin Cities do a lot of the RCRA inspections. I personally think that if the state doesn't take delegation, there's two steps. They've got to take delegation, then they've got to take delegation seriously. But without that delegation, I just think it makes it harder, especially to reach those small facilities.
Thank you for speaking today. My question pertains to the citizen science monitoring. For those of us interested in getting involved, are there any smartphone applications or programs that you recommend?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to look at is that there's a really active citizen science organization, and I think it might be just citizenscience.org. So that's a good starting point. If you just Google search citizen science, you'll see a lot of it. EPA, if you do a Google search on EPA for citizen science, you'll see a lot of information on that site. And then the Woodrow Wilson Institute, which is a Washington, D.C. think tank, has a citizen science program. And again, if you look at the Woodrow Wilson Institute and Google it for citizen science, you'll find quite a lot of information there. There are, citizen science is a broad term, so sometimes bird counts, that's citizen science. Lots of different things that citizens do related to environment and natural resources that are citizen science. But the specific focus where I think citizen science can be helpful is when citizens are doing environmental monitoring, especially in areas where, community environmental monitoring for toxins where doesn't exist. You have to look at the reliability of the instrument itself. It might be an attachment to your cell phone, it might be a handheld monitor. And then you have to look at or think about what that data could be used for by government. If you're the river keeper and you're doing citizen science, you're going to put it in your citizen suit the next time you sue somebody because they violated the Clean Water Act. But it may be that your citizen science finds a problem that you think may exist, and it's a complaint or a referral to an environmental agency, or maybe it's just data you suggest that you talk with the company about. We found this data. Do you think it's accurate? What's your data show? Why are we seeing this in our community? So it's citizen science data for environmental purposes can be at least thought of in a fairly wide range of contexts.
Hi, thanks for coming. So I wanted to ask, you were talking about the third-party verifications and the, sort of self-reporting. I was wondering, for third-party verification in particular, what the cost of that was and whether it was, more or less expensive than having more federal monitors. And then the accuracy of that and of self-reporting and whether there are any concerns about, the accuracy there.
Yeah, so I don't know the specific cost of third-party verification. What I can say is that in almost every state, which is not true everywhere, but in almost every state, getting budget dollars for more inspectors at a state environmental agency is almost a non-starter. And if you look over the history of the last 40 years in environmental law, in the staff size for both state and federal agencies, when you normalize for inflation, the budgets are dramatically lower than they were in the early 1970s or even in the early 80s. So part of what's happening for agencies is that they really have to look for other solutions. They may not be the ideal solution. It might be that you're much better off having another 10 government inspectors in a particular area. But unless it's an area where it's gotten a lot of public attention, the resources, that's not going to be there. I think in the states that use third-party verification that have a fairly elaborate qualification protocol for third-party inspectors, including conflict of interest criteria. So I think in most cases, and Massachusetts does a really good job with its environmental work in general, I would be comfortable with those third-party verifications as long as it's done in a state that's, that pays attention to the details. Self-reporting, it can be problematic, but again, it's a question of how do you deploy resources. If you get no reporting, without, then it doesn't help you. So if you can get some self-reporting that is good and legitimate, like the EPA and state audit policies, which allow self-reporting and penalties to be reduced if you have a good environmental management system, if you promptly correct the violation, if you take steps to make sure the violation doesn't occur again, then my view is the risk of kind of gaming the system is relatively low, and the upside is you get environmental improvement that you might not have been able to get in any other way. So a lot of these new methods, including using citizen science, well, if we have more government monitors, we probably don't need as much citizen science, but we have to kind of look at what the real world context is and where the budgets are, and try to do the best we can in a very big system of compliance and enforcement that doesn't have the resources that it probably should have.
Maybe there's time for one more. Let's see.
Right. All right, well, let me just go ahead and dive into the controversial, or some may perceive as. I'm curious, one, if President Biden has done anything to increase funding for monitoring, because he's got a lot of programs going with climate change and whatnot. And the second one, my second question is just briefly, what do you feel the outlook for this topic will be, depending on who might possibly win the election?
That's quite a fine question.
Yeah. Well, we don't know specific numbers for the Biden administration, but they've placed a lot more emphasis on especially monitoring in communities that have been underserved. And my expectation is that there has been more money, whether it's infrastructure money or budget money put into those areas. You know, on the second question, all I can say is I was in Washington for the previous administration, and the resources that the environmental agencies had suffered significantly. There was definitely less emphasis on environment, and I would expect the same thing to happen.
All right. Well, thank you again for a wonderful presentation and for being open to questions. Let's get Professor Paddock on.